In the year 1295, three strange-looking men arrived at the port of Venice. Their ragged clothes and tanned faces indicated that they had come from afar. They spoke Italian, but with a heavy foreign accent. They had difficulty finding their way through the alleys, since the city had changed so much since they left it 24 years earlier. These were Marco Polo, his father Niccolò, and his uncle Maffeo, who returned from their long journey to the east. When they finally got home, their relatives could hardly recognize them. They marveled at the treasures they had brought with them, diamonds and gemstones, the likes of which they had never seen. But they were even more amazed by the stories they had to tell of their adventures in the deserts of Persia and Afghanistan, and of the court of the Mongolian Emperor Kublai Khan. Is it possible that this event changed history forever? Could it be responsible for the economic trouble we are experiencing today? Several years after his return to Venice, Marco Polo was captured during a battle with the Republic of Genoa. During his time in prison, he described his adventures to his cellmate, who later published them in a book. His story depicts life in Imperial China during the Yuan dynasty. Among other things, it mentions the monetary system which was introduced by Kublai Khan and was based on paper notes stamped with his royal seal. When the Venetians first heard this story, they dismissed it as fantasy. They found it hard to believe that anyone would be willing to accept payment in worthless pieces of paper instead of gold or silver coins. Nevertheless, this is probably how the idea of using paper money came to Europe. This method probably stems from the habit of Chinese merchants at the time to deposit their gold coins at a secured warehouse. In exchange for the gold, they received a document which confirmed that a certain amount was deposited in their name. The merchants soon realized that for large transactions, it was easier to exchange the receipts than to physically go to the warehouse and exchange the coins. At first, all parties involved knew that the paper note was nothing more than a receipt, and that the real money was deposited at the vault. But as time went on, people grew accustomed to the convenience of using paper notes, and forgot that they weren't real money. During the Renaissance, along with the rise of an urban middle class, banking began to develop in Europe. More and more people were no longer serfs in the service of a feudal lord, and instead became successful merchants and craftsmen. Those who managed to accumulate some wealth wanted to invest it, and those who wanted to expand their business required loans. The banks that began to appear throughout Italy were designed to serve both needs. They borrowed from the former in the short term and lent to the latter in the long term, profiting from the difference in interest rates. This business model proved itself to be extremely lucrative. Some of these bankers, such as the Medici family from the city of Florence, became very rich and powerful, both financially and politically. Just as happened in China, people found it easier to conduct their business with paper notes. It greatly reduced the risk of robberies. It also facilitated the transfer of funds across great distances. Merchants were no longer required to carry with them large amounts of gold as they traveled from country to country. Instead, they could use paper notes, which were honored by other branches of the bank all across the continent. This facilitated trade and helped the economy grow, but it also introduced a new kind of risk called the counterparty risk. People were no longer holding the physical gold in their hands. If for some reason the bank went under, they could lose their money. But the use of paper notes had an even more insidious side effect. There was a huge temptation for the banks to issue more notes than there was gold in their vaults. This way they could loan out more money and earn more interest. Since most customers trusted the bank and only rarely asked to withdraw their gold, this fraud could be kept secret. We call this devious practice fractional reserve banking, and at the time it was illegal. Since the public treated the banknotes as if they were gold coins, there was more money in circulation, chasing the same amount of goods. The artificial expansion of the money supply generated inflation, and as a result, prices started creeping up. The scam was only revealed if too many customers showed up at the same time and demanded their gold. If the bank was unable to grant their request, panic would ensue. The news that a certain bank was insolvent would quickly spread across town. Hundreds of angry customers would rush in, demanding to receive their money. We call such an event a run on the bank. It led to the collapse of numerous banks and sent their disgraced owners to prison. Back in the day, the fear of a bank run was the only thing keeping bank owners from issuing an unlimited amount of banknotes and producing an unlimited amount of inflation. Whenever a bank collapsed and its paper bills lost all value, there was a sudden contraction of the money supply, which we call deflation. This often led to a recession, because the citizens who lost their savings had to cut back on their spending, and this had a negative impact on the entire economy. Eventually, the authorities became aware of these destructive cycles of inflation and deflation and tried to stop them. During the 17th century, central banks began to appear throughout Europe. Their original purpose was to supervise the commercial banks, and in case of an emergency, provide them with liquidity and prevent their collapse. Among them we can mention the Bank of Amsterdam, which was established in 1609, and the Central Bank of Sweden, which was established in 1668. But the institution which most inspired today's central bank is undoubtedly the Bank of England. Many times in history, developments in the financial system are the result of some kind of crisis. In 1694, King William III of Great Britain found himself in financial difficulty. He needed a large sum of money in order to finance the ongoing war against France, and none of the banks in London was willing to lend him the necessary amount, not even for a hefty interest rate of 8%. Therefore, his Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Montague, devised a plan, according to which a cartel of banks would be established. This cartel would manage the government's accounts and grant it loans, and in return receive the exclusive right to issue banknotes in the United Kingdom. In other words, the right to issue paper money was taken away from the free market and granted to a few privileged bankers, protected by the government. As we can see, central banks were originally established as private institutions, whose purpose was to protect the interests of the banks. Over the centuries, the boundaries between them and the governments became blurred. Nowadays, they are considered as an organ of the state, whose role is to maintain the stability of the economy. However, compared to other government agencies, they enjoy a high degree of independence. Their members are unelected, and their policy is not subject to public scrutiny. Their authority to create new money gives them enormous power. And in the past decade, we have seen how they abuse this power, hurting the savers and exacerbating the inequality between the rich and the poor. Do you think that the establishment of central banks put an end to the nefarious practice of fractional reserve banking? On the contrary, it only formalized it and made it legal. The members of the banking cartel were officially allowed to grant loans in excess of their capital, and they happily took advantage of it. They were no longer afraid of issuing too many loans, because they knew that in the event of a bank run, the central bank would come to their rescue. Supposedly, in such a system, there is no limit on the amount of banknotes that can be printed, and on the amount of inflation that can be created. This could potentially put the central bank in danger. If too many citizens appeared all at once, demanding to convert their notes into gold, the central bank itself could collapse. Therefore, it had to put a limit on the amount of credit that the member banks were allowed to issue. This was done through a mechanism called the reserve ratio, which set a certain ratio between the amount of reserves each bank held at the central bank and the amount of loans it was allowed to give. By dialing the reserve ratio up and down, the central bank was able to regulate the total amount of credit in the system and theoretically put a lid on inflation. The monetary system we've just described is known as the gold standard. It allowed for a certain amount of inflation and therefore was far from perfect. But as long as the government kept a balanced budget and the central bank didn't monetize its debts, the rate of inflation was tolerable. Countries which implemented this system usually enjoyed a robust rate of growth, which balanced the inflation and allowed the citizens to prosper. Backing the currency with gold, even if only partially, helped stabilize its value and protect the savings of the citizens. Under the gold standard, Britain went through the Industrial Revolution, grew stronger, and became an empire. During this period, the pound sterling was the global reserve currency. And if Britain hadn't abandoned the gold standard during World War I, it would perhaps remain dominant till this very day. After World War II, the United States took over the role of the leading superpower, and the dollar became the global reserve currency. According to the terms of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the dollar was supposed to be backed by gold, and other nations were supposed to hold dollar reserves. This way, their currencies would indirectly be backed by gold as well. However, during the 1950s and 60s, the federal government had abused its power, spent too many dollars, and issued too much debt. Inflation started to pick up. The United States trading partners became concerned that there wasn't enough gold in Fort Knox in order to back all the dollars in circulation. Led by France, they started converting their dollar reserves into gold, and the United States gold reserves gradually declined. This was tantamount to a run on the bank, only on a global scale. Afraid that the US may run out of gold, President Richard Nixon decided to put an end to this. On August 15, 1971, he gave a televised address in which he announced his decision to suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The implications of this event, which is now known as the Nixon Shock, were not fully understood at the time, but in retrospect, it severed the last connection between the dollar and gold, ushering in the era of fiat currencies. Since central banks are no longer obliged to back their currencies with gold, they can manufacture them in any amount they deem necessary. There is also no restriction on the amount of credit that commercial banks can give to their customers. As a matter of fact, after 2008, the reserve requirements which we mentioned earlier became largely irrelevant, and in 2020 they were cancelled altogether. This is the greatest swindle in human history. While we the people need to work hard for our money, the banking system can simply print it out of thin air and then charge interest on it. It allows the government to gradually siphon away the purchasing power of our savings without us being aware. Until recently, most of the newly created money flowed into assets such as stocks, bonds, and real estate, and the prices of commodities stayed relatively tame. This benefited mainly the rich because they own the vast majority of these assets. But since 2020, the flow of money has shifted. All of the liquidity which was created in the past decades is threatening to spill into the commodity sector, pushing up the prices of consumer goods and making the cost of living unbearable. It is becoming clear that the current monetary system is unsustainable, and that sooner or later it will collapse on its own. The only question is what kind of system will replace it. Will our leaders see the error of their ways and once again back the currency with some kind of tangible good? Or, in a desperate attempt to preserve their power, try to launch yet another fiat currency? I believe that by holding physical gold and silver, we the citizens can force them to do the right thing. Thank you for listening to the Silver Hermit podcast. If you like this content, please donate in the link which appears in the description below. Please subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends and family. Hit the bell icon to be notified whenever I release a new video. Remember, I'm not a licensed financial advisor. This video is intended for general informational purposes only and should not be regarded as investment advice. Before taking any investment decision, please consult with a professional financial advisor who may assess your personal investment objectives and needs.